Sometimes everything in a relationship is going well, and that's exactly when something inside you starts to feel off. You go on good dates. You feel respected. They text consistently. They make plans. They treat you well. And yet, slowly, something changes. You start feeling restless. You notice yourself pulling back a little. You begin overthinking small things. You miss the excitement you felt at the beginning. And for some reason, you start wondering if something is wrong. The strangest part is, you don't really know why this happens. Nothing bad happened. No big fight. No obvious red flags. This video isn't about choosing the wrong partners. It's about why stability can start to feel uncomfortable once the relationship becomes safe. What if the problem isn't the relationship, but what your nervous system learned to expect from love? At first, this feeling is almost invisible. Nothing dramatic happens. No clear moment where everything changes. It's more like a slow shift you can't quite point to. You just notice that something feels different. You still like them. You still enjoy being together. You still think they're a good person. But the excitement that once felt effortless now feels quieter. Softer. Less urgent. And that quiet can feel confusing. Because this is what you thought you wanted. Someone consistent. Someone reliable. Someone who texts back. Someone who makes plans. Someone who doesn't disappear for days and then reappear like nothing happened. You finally have stability. So why does part of you feel less certain now that you finally have it? You might notice the change in small moments. You wake up and see their message, but you don't feel the same rush you felt at the beginning. You still smile. You still reply. But the emotional spark feels calmer. More predictable. And instead of feeling relieved, a strange thought appears: is this it? You don't say it out loud. You don't even fully admit it to yourself. But it sits quietly in the background. When the relationship first started, everything felt intense. You checked your phone constantly. You replayed conversations in your head. You wondered what they were thinking. You felt butterflies, anticipation, uncertainty. Every message felt important. Every plan felt exciting. Every moment felt charged with possibility. Now the messages arrive when you expect them. Plans are made in advance. Conversations feel steady. You know where you stand. And instead of feeling safe, something inside you feels restless. You might start missing the early stage of the relationship. Not the person, but the feeling. The anticipation. The unpredictability. The emotional highs and lows. It feels confusing to admit this, because nothing is actually wrong. They treat you well. They show up. They communicate clearly. They don't play games. This is the kind of relationship people say they want. So when discomfort appears, it creates a quiet guilt. You start wondering if you're the problem. Am I getting bored? Am I sabotaging this? Why don't I feel the same excitement anymore? You may start scanning the relationship for problems that don't clearly exist. You notice tiny changes in tone. Small pauses in conversation. Moments where the spark feels less intense. Your mind begins searching for explanations. Maybe we don't have enough chemistry. Maybe we're too different. Maybe something is missing. These thoughts feel logical. Reasonable. Responsible. After all, relationships are important. It makes sense to evaluate them carefully. But underneath the logical thoughts, something more emotional is happening. The relationship is becoming predictable. And predictability feels unfamiliar. In the early stage, you didn't know what would happen next. Would they text? Would they call? Would they make plans? Would they pull away? Uncertainty created emotional movement. Your mind stayed alert. Your body stayed engaged. Your attention stayed focused. Now, the uncertainty is fading. You know they will text back. You know they will show up. You know they care. And without uncertainty, something inside you loses its sense of urgency. Your nervous system stops scanning for signals. Stops searching for signs. Stops preparing for emotional shifts. And that calm can feel strangely empty. You may notice this most in the quiet moments, sitting together on the couch, driving together in silence, spending a weekend with no big plans. These are the moments many people describe as peaceful, comfortable, secure. But if you're used to emotional intensity, they can feel unfamiliar. Silence can feel loud. Calm can feel suspicious. Stability can feel flat. You may start wondering if the relationship has lost its spark. But what you're really noticing is the absence of emotional turbulence. And turbulence, even when stressful, creates a sense of movement. Movement creates stimulation. Stimulation creates emotional engagement. Without it, the relationship begins to feel slower. And slower can feel like something is missing. This is where confusion deepens. You don't want chaos. You don't want drama. You don't want instability. You want a healthy relationship. But when you experience one, your emotional system doesn't immediately recognize it as exciting. Because excitement has often been linked to unpredictability, to emotional ups and downs, to uncertainty, to not knowing where you stand. So when stability replaces unpredictability, your nervous system interprets the shift as a loss of intensity. And intensity has often felt like connection. This is why people sometimes say things like, "The spark is gone. It feels different now. It's not as exciting as it used to be." These statements don't mean the relationship is worse. They often mean the relationship is calmer. And calm can feel unfamiliar if your emotional system learned to associate love with emotional movement. You may notice yourself creating small tests without realizing it. Taking longer to reply. Waiting to see if they notice. Pulling back slightly to observe their reaction, not because you want to hurt them, but because distance creates movement. Movement creates feeling. Feeling creates reassurance. If they move closer when you move away, the emotional intensity briefly returns. And that intensity feels familiar. So the cycle continues quietly. You move back. They move closer. Emotion rises again. And for a moment, the relationship feels alive. Not because distance is healthy, but because distance creates emotional activation. Without realizing it, you may begin confusing activation with connection. You may start believing that excitement equals love, and calm equals boredom. But what you're actually experiencing is the difference between emotional stimulation and emotional safety. And this difference can feel deeply unsettling when you've spent years associating love with emotional highs and lows. Because if love is no longer intense, dramatic, or unpredictable, then what is it? And this question begins opening the door to something deeper. And once this question appears, something subtle begins to happen inside your everyday life. You start paying more attention to how the relationship feels rather than what the relationship actually is. At the beginning, you were focused on what was happening, the dates, the conversations, the connection, the chemistry. Everything felt new and emotionally loud, so you didn't need to analyze it. But now, the relationship has settled into a rhythm. And when rhythm replaces novelty, the mind begins searching for meaning. You start asking yourself questions that didn't exist before. Do I still feel the same way? Is this how love is supposed to feel long-term? Shouldn't I feel more excited than this? The relationship hasn't changed dramatically, but your internal experience of it has shifted. And because we tend to trust feelings as signals, the shift starts to feel important. You begin observing your reactions more closely. You notice that you don't check your phone as obsessively. You notice that plans feel comfortable instead of thrilling. You notice that time together feels easy instead of electric. And suddenly, easy starts to feel suspicious. You might not say it out loud, but the thought appears quietly. Maybe the spark is fading. This thought creates a new kind of tension. Not the tension of uncertainty, but the tension of doubt. And doubt changes how you experience the relationship. You start monitoring your own emotions. You start analyzing your level of excitement. You start comparing the present to the beginning. You remember how intense everything felt early on. How fast your heart beat before seeing them. How conversations lasted late into the night. How every message felt charged with meaning. That early intensity becomes the emotional benchmark. Without realizing it, you begin comparing stability to the memory of excitement. And stability loses the comparison. Because excitement is loud and memorable. Calm is quiet and easy to overlook. This is where the mind begins trying to solve the feeling. You may start wondering if something is missing. Maybe we don't have enough chemistry. Maybe we're too comfortable. Maybe we're more like friends. These thoughts feel logical because they offer an explanation for the emotional shift. But they don't actually explain why the shift feels uncomfortable. What's happening isn't a lack of connection. It's a change in emotional intensity. And when emotional intensity drops, the nervous system starts searching for stimulation. Not consciously. Automatically. This is when subtle behaviors begin appearing. You might notice yourself feeling slightly more interested when they are busy. Slightly more curious when they are less available. Slightly more excited when plans change unexpectedly. Uncertainty creates movement. Movement creates anticipation. Anticipation creates emotional activation. Your mind becomes more alert when the emotional rhythm becomes less predictable. This can create confusing emotional moments. You might feel a sudden rush of affection after a small conflict. You might feel closer after a brief period of distance. You might feel more attracted when they pull back slightly. These reactions don't mean you want distance. They mean your nervous system reacts strongly to emotional movement. When the relationship becomes stable, the emotional movement decreases. And when movement decreases, your system begins looking for it. You may start replaying memories of past relationships without meaning to. Not because you want those relationships back, but because you remember how intense they felt. The late-night conversations. The emotional ups and downs. The unpredictability. Those memories feel vivid because intensity leaves strong emotional impressions. Your current relationship, in comparison, feels quieter. And quiet can feel like absence when you're used to intensity. This doesn't mean you prefer chaos. It means chaos created stimulation. Stimulation creates focus. Focus creates emotional engagement. Without stimulation, attention relaxes. And relaxed attention can feel like fading attention. You may start questioning your feelings more often. Do I really like them? Do I feel the same way? Is this long-term love or settling? These questions feel responsible. Thoughtful. Mature. But they often come from discomfort with calm rather than problems in the relationship. You might notice this most when life slows down. After the honeymoon phase. After routines form. After the relationship becomes part of daily life. Excitement used to come from anticipation. Now the relationship exists inside routine. Routine is stable. Routine is predictable. Routine is safe. But routine is rarely thrilling. And when thrill disappears, the brain sometimes interprets the change as loss. Not loss of love. Loss of stimulation. You might also notice how strongly you react to small changes in attention. If they take longer to reply one day, your interest suddenly spikes. If they cancel plans unexpectedly, you feel a rush of emotion. If they seem distracted, your attention sharpens. Suddenly, your mind is fully engaged again. You think about them more. You wonder what changed. You feel emotionally activated. And that activation feels familiar. Because emotional activation has often accompanied connection. So your system quietly links activation with closeness. Without realizing it, you begin associating emotional movement with emotional depth. Calm begins to feel flat. Distance begins to feel meaningful. Uncertainty begins to feel engaging. This can create a confusing push-pull experience. You want stability. But you feel more emotionally activated by unpredictability. You want consistency. But you feel more emotionally alert when consistency wavers. This doesn't mean you want instability. It means instability activates your attention. And attention feels like emotional connection. Your nervous system begins scanning the relationship for signs of movement. Small disagreements feel intense. Unexpected changes feel exciting. Moments of distance feel emotionally charged. Meanwhile, peaceful evenings, quiet weekends, and predictable routines feel neutral. Neutral can feel like boredom when your emotional system is used to activation. You might start creating subtle distance without realizing it. Spending a little more time alone. Focusing more on work. Replying a little slower. Not to hurt the relationship, but to create space. And space creates movement. Movement creates attention. Attention creates feeling. This cycle is incredibly subtle. Most people don't notice it happening. They only notice the conclusion. Something feels off. And because the feeling appears inside a healthy relationship, the relationship becomes the suspect. Maybe this isn't right. Maybe something is missing. Maybe we're not compatible. These thoughts feel logical because they match the emotional discomfort. But they don't explain why stability feels uncomfortable in the first place. To understand that, we need to go deeper than current relationships and look at the emotional patterns that were forming long before this one began. And when you begin looking deeper, something important becomes clear. This feeling didn't start in this relationship. It didn't begin with this person. It didn't begin with dating apps. It didn't begin in adulthood. By the time you reached adult relationships, your nervous system already had an emotional template for what connection is supposed to feel like. Not what it is supposed to look like. What it is supposed to feel like. And feelings are powerful teachers. Most people assume their relationship preferences come from conscious choices. But emotional preferences are often shaped long before conscious choice exists. They are shaped in the background of everyday life. In early environments where connection was present, but not always emotionally steady. This doesn't mean childhood was bad. It doesn't mean love was absent. It doesn't mean anything dramatic happened. In many cases, love was real. Care was real. Support was real. But emotional availability wasn't always consistent. Sometimes caregivers were warm and attentive. Sometimes they were busy, stressed, distracted, or overwhelmed. Sometimes they had emotional energy to give. Sometimes they didn't. Children don't interpret this as inconsistency. Children experience it as something they must adapt to. Because connection is safety. And when connection feels unpredictable, the nervous system becomes alert. It begins tracking emotional signals. Tone changes. Mood shifts. Energy in the room. Children become experts at noticing when attention is present and when it isn't. They don't think about it consciously. Their nervous system simply learns what brings connection closer and what makes it drift away. They learn what gets smiles. What gets praise. What reduces tension. What keeps things smooth. Maybe being helpful brings attention. Maybe being quiet avoids stress. Maybe being easy keeps harmony. No one explains this process. It happens through repetition. And repetition turns behavior into emotional learning. A child might notice that when they are calm and cooperative, the environment feels peaceful. When they create problems, the environment feels tense. When they help, connection increases. When they need too much, connection feels uncertain. These moments are small, but they accumulate. The nervous system begins forming an emotional equation. Connection feels safest when emotional tension is low. Emotional tension lowers when I adapt quickly. So adaptation becomes automatic. Reading moods becomes automatic. Responding quickly becomes automatic. Staying emotionally attentive becomes automatic. This early emotional learning creates familiarity with emotional movement. Connection feels active. Connection feels dynamic. Connection feels like something that shifts and changes. And because attention sometimes fluctuated, the nervous system learned to stay alert to those fluctuations. Alertness became part of connection. Years later, in adult relationships, this early emotional training still exists. But now it appears in a new environment. Instead of caregivers, there are partners. Instead of family dynamics, there are romantic dynamics. The nervous system still looks for emotional movement. It still tracks closeness and distance. It still responds strongly to shifts in attention. So when a relationship becomes stable and predictable, the emotional rhythm changes. The ups and downs fade. The signals become steady. The emotional environment becomes calm. And calm feels unfamiliar. Not wrong. Unfamiliar. Your nervous system doesn't recognize calm as connection. It recognizes calm as the absence of movement. And movement has always been part of connection. This is why emotional distance can feel strangely activating. When someone pulls away slightly, attention sharpens. When someone becomes less predictable, curiosity increases. When emotional signals fluctuate, the nervous system wakes up. This activation feels like emotional engagement. And emotional engagement feels like connection. So the nervous system quietly links activation with closeness. Meanwhile, stable relationships reduce emotional activation. There is less guessing. Less monitoring. Less anticipation. And without activation, attention relaxes. Relaxed attention can feel like fading attention. You may interpret this as losing interest, but what you are actually experiencing is the absence of emotional alertness. And alertness has been part of your experience of connection for a long time. This is why you may remember past relationships as more intense. Not necessarily better. More intense. Intensity leaves strong emotional memories. The uncertainty. The longing. The anticipation. These emotions create vivid experiences. Stable relationships create calm experiences. Calm experiences are harder to remember vividly. The nervous system doesn't store calm as urgently as it stores activation. So memory begins favoring intensity over stability. And this makes the past feel more emotionally alive than the present. This doesn't mean the past was healthier. It means the past contained more emotional movement. When your current relationship becomes calm, the contrast becomes noticeable. Your mind begins comparing emotional intensity rather than emotional health. And intensity often wins the comparison. Because intensity feels alive. Calm feels quiet. Quiet can feel like absence when your nervous system learned to associate connection with emotional movement. This is why the feeling of something is missing appears. Not because love is missing. Because emotional activation is missing. And without understanding this difference, the mind begins searching for explanations in the relationship itself. Maybe the chemistry is fading. Maybe the spark is gone. Maybe the relationship has run its course. These conclusions feel logical because they match the emotional shift. But they don't explain why stability feels uncomfortable. To understand that, we need to look at how the nervous system connects emotional activation with emotional safety. And once we understand that connection, the entire experience begins to make sense. And once you begin to see this pattern clearly, something important starts to shift. What once felt like random emotions begins to look more like a nervous system trying to stay in familiar territory. Up to this point, we've stayed inside experiences, what you feel, what you notice, what happens in relationships. Now we can gently name what has been happening underneath all of this. Your nervous system does not measure love by logic. It measures love by familiarity. Familiarity equals safety. Not because familiar things are always good. Because familiar things are predictable. And predictability is what the nervous system trusts. When you grow up in emotional environments where connection includes uncertainty, emotional movement becomes part of the definition of closeness. Not consciously. Emotionally. The brain begins linking certain sensations with connection. Anticipation. Emotional ups and downs. Waiting. Wondering. Emotional spikes. These sensations become part of the emotional signature of closeness. So years later, when a relationship feels calm and steady, your nervous system compares it to the emotional signature it already knows. And something doesn't match. The relationship may be healthy, but the emotional signature feels different. And the nervous system reacts to difference before the mind has time to interpret it. This reaction often shows up as restlessness. A subtle feeling that something is off. A quiet urge to create movement. A desire to feel more. Not more love. More activation. Activation is what the nervous system recognizes as emotional engagement. And engagement has long been tied to closeness. This is why stable relationships can feel confusing. Instead of emotional highs and lows, there is consistency. Instead of uncertainty, there is predictability. Instead of anticipation, there is reliability. And reliability doesn't create the same chemical response in the brain that uncertainty does. Uncertainty activates dopamine. Dopamine is the brain's anticipation chemical. It is released when we don't know what will happen next. It is released when we are waiting. When we are hoping. When we are guessing. The early stage of relationships is full of dopamine. Will they text? Will they call? Will they make plans? Will they like me as much as I like them? Every unknown creates anticipation. Every anticipation creates dopamine. And dopamine creates emotional intensity. This intensity feels exciting. It feels engaging. It feels alive. But dopamine is not the chemical of long-term connection. Long-term connection relies more on oxytocin and serotonin. Chemicals associated with safety, trust, and bonding. These chemicals create calm rather than excitement. They create warmth rather than urgency. They create comfort rather than anticipation. The shift from dopamine to oxytocin is the shift from early attraction to stable connection. But if your nervous system learned to associate dopamine with love, this shift can feel like a loss. Not a loss of connection. A loss of intensity. And the brain often misinterprets the loss of intensity as the loss of feelings. You may start thinking, I don't feel the same spark anymore. Maybe we lost the chemistry. Maybe this relationship isn't right. But what you are actually experiencing is the transition from excitement to safety. From anticipation to stability. From uncertainty to predictability. And for a nervous system trained in emotional alertness, safety can feel unfamiliar. Unfamiliar can feel uncomfortable. This is why you may feel more emotionally activated when something goes slightly wrong. A delayed message. A cancelled plan. A small disagreement. These moments bring uncertainty back. And uncertainty brings dopamine back. Suddenly, your mind becomes alert again. You think about the relationship more. You feel emotionally engaged again. You feel movement again. This can create a confusing emotional loop. Calm feels flat. Uncertainty feels alive. Stability feels quiet. Distance feels engaging. Without realizing it, the nervous system begins chasing activation. Not because it wants instability, but because activation feels familiar. This is where many people begin creating small amounts of emotional movement without noticing. Pulling back slightly. Testing the connection. Creating space. These actions are rarely conscious sabotage. They are unconscious attempts to restore emotional activation. Because activation feels like connection. This is why people sometimes feel closer after a conflict. Arguments create emotional spikes. Emotional spikes create activation. Activation feels like engagement. After the conflict resolves, the emotional closeness feels stronger. Not because conflict is healthy, but because activation returned. Without understanding this pattern, people can start believing that emotional intensity equals emotional depth. But intensity and depth are not the same. Intensity is loud. Depth is steady. Intensity rises and falls. Depth remains. Intensity feels exciting. Depth feels safe. And if your nervous system learned to associate love with intensity, depth can feel unfamiliar. Not wrong. Unfamiliar. This is the moment where many relationships are misunderstood. The relationship hasn't lost its spark. It has changed its emotional chemistry. From adrenaline to oxytocin. From anticipation to trust. From excitement to safety. And safety is quiet. Quiet is easy to overlook. Quiet is easy to question. Quiet is easy to misinterpret. Especially if your emotional history taught you that love is loud. But once you begin to understand this shift, something changes. You stop asking, "Why does this feel boring?" And start asking, "Why does calm feel unfamiliar?" And this question opens the door to the most important shift of all. Learning how to experience safety without mistaking it for the absence of love. And once you begin to see this clearly, something inside you starts to relax. Not all at once. Not in a dramatic way. But slowly, quietly. Because the confusion finally has a language. The relationship didn't suddenly become wrong. The feelings didn't suddenly disappear. The spark didn't magically die. The emotional landscape changed. What once felt intense became stable. What once felt uncertain became predictable. What once felt urgent became calm. And your nervous system simply didn't recognize calm as love yet. That realization can feel deeply relieving. Because it removes the silent pressure to constantly search for something missing. It allows you to stop interpreting calm as boredom. Stop interpreting safety as loss. Stop interpreting stability as a warning sign. Instead, you begin to notice something new. How peaceful it feels to not wonder where you stand. How grounding it feels to not overanalyze every message. How quiet your mind becomes when connection is consistent. At first, these moments may feel unfamiliar. Silence may feel loud. Predictability may feel strange. Ease may feel suspicious. But unfamiliar does not mean wrong. It simply means new. Your nervous system is learning a different rhythm of connection. A rhythm that doesn't depend on anticipation. A rhythm that doesn't depend on emotional spikes. A rhythm that doesn't depend on uncertainty. A rhythm built on presence. This kind of connection doesn't rush your heartbeat. It doesn't keep you guessing. It doesn't create emotional highs and lows. It creates space. Space to breathe. Space to relax. Space to exist without constantly monitoring the relationship. And that space can feel disorienting at first. Because your system has spent years associating love with movement. Now it is learning to associate love with stillness. And stillness takes time to trust. You may still notice moments where your mind searches for excitement. Moments where you question the calm. Moments where you miss the early intensity. That's normal. You are not doing anything wrong. You are simply learning a new emotional language. One where love doesn't need to feel dramatic to be real. One where connection doesn't need to feel urgent to be strong. One where stability doesn't mean something is missing. Over time, something beautiful begins to happen. The calm stops feeling empty. The quiet stops feeling suspicious. The stability stops feeling flat. Instead, it starts to feel safe. You begin to notice the comfort of consistency. The warmth of reliability. The peace of knowing someone is there. And that peace becomes its own kind of excitement. A softer excitement. A deeper excitement. One that doesn't rise and fall quickly. One that stays. This is the moment where the relationship stops feeling wrong. And starts feeling real. And the more you allow yourself to experience this new rhythm, the more natural it becomes. Because love was never meant to keep you on edge. It was meant to let you rest. And sometimes, the hardest part of a healthy relationship is learning to trust how calm it feels.